The bitter Chicago wind cut through the thin walls of the tenement building like a blade through silk, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and desperation. Tommy. Romano pressed his face against the frost-covered window of the cramped apartment, watching the black automobiles roll past on the cobblestone streets below. Even at 15, he understood that those cars meant power, money, and respect. Everything his adoptive family seemed to lack. "Get away from that window, you worthless bastard," came the harsh voice of Vincent Romano, the man who had reluctantly taken Tommy in after his mother's death 5 years prior. Vincent's heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floor as he stumbled toward the kitchen, reeking of cheap whiskey and cigarettes. "Your brothers need to get ready for school, and you're blocking the light." Tommy stepped aside without a word, his jaw clenched tight. His brothers, Vincent's biological sons, Marco and Sal, were already dressed in their pressed uniforms, preparing for another day at St. Mary's Catholic School. Tommy, meanwhile, wore the same patched trousers and worn shirt he'd had for 3 years, clothes that marked him as different, as less than. "Why does he even live here?" Marco sneered, adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness. At 17, he had inherited his father's cruel streak and seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting Tommy. "He's not even blood, just some street rat Ma felt sorry for." "Marco, enough," said Maria Romano, Vincent's wife, though her voice lacked conviction. She stirred a pot of thin porridge on the stove, her movements mechanical and tired. "Tommy, you'll be late for the factory." The Castellano textile factory sat like a gray monument to industrial misery on the south side of Chicago. At 14, Tommy had lied about his age to get the job, and for the past year, he'd spent 12 hours a day operating the dangerous machinery that churned out fabric for the city's growing population. The work was brutal, the pay meager, but it was his contribution to the Romano household, a household that never let him forget he didn't truly belong. The factory floor was a symphony of mechanical noise and human suffering. Steam hissed from the massive looms while workers, mostly immigrants and children, moved between the machines like ghosts. Tommy had grown skilled at reading the subtle changes in the machinery's rhythm, the slight variations that could mean the difference between a productive day and a crushed hand. "Romano!" The foreman's voice boomed over the industrial cacophony. Jack Murphy was a thick-set Irishman with scarred knuckles and a perpetual scowl. "Machine 7's acting up again. Fix it or we dock your pay." Tommy nodded and made his way to the problematic loom. As he worked, adjusting gears and oiling mechanisms, he caught fragments of conversation from the older workers. They spoke in hushed tones about the changing landscape of Chicago's underworld, about territorial disputes between Irish and Italian gangs, about a mysterious figure known only as the Old Man, who supposedly controlled much of the city's illegal activities. "You hear about the Torino family," whispered Giuseppe, an elderly Italian who worked the machine next to Tommy's. "Someone's been picking them off one by one. Word is, it's connected to some old vendetta." The lunch whistle blew at noon, and Tommy found himself alone on the factory's fire escape, eating a meager sandwich while watching the city sprawl before him. Chicago in 1923 was a city of contradictions, gleaming skyscrapers rising next to squalid tenements, wealthy businessmen sharing streets with beggars and thieves. Prohibition had turned ordinary citizens into criminals, and criminals into kings. From his perch, Tommy could see the lake stretching endlessly toward the horizon, its gray waters reflecting the overcast sky. Sometimes he dreamed of boarding a ship and sailing away from this life, away from the constant reminders that he was unwanted, unwelcome, unloved. But dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford. The afternoon shift was interrupted by unusual commotion outside the factory. Through the grimy windows, Tommy could see several expensive black automobiles parked along the street. Men in dark suits and fedoras stood beside the cars, their movements precise and purposeful. Even from a distance, there was something different about them, an air of authority that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. "Looks like the big boys are making their rounds," muttered Giuseppe, following Tommy's gaze. "Best to keep our heads down and our mouths shut." But Tommy found himself studying the men with intense curiosity. There was something familiar about one of them, an older gentleman with silver hair and a perfectly tailored coat. The man moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to power, someone who expected obedience without question. When their eyes met across the distance, Tommy felt an inexplicable jolt of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. The workday finally ended as dusk settled over Chicago like a heavy blanket. Tommy made his way home through streets that grew more dangerous as darkness fell. The city's underbelly came alive at night. Speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors, gambling dens tucked away in basement rooms, and the ever-present threat of violence that simmered just beneath the surface of everyday life. The Romano apartment was thick with tension when Tommy arrived. Vincent sat at the kitchen table, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he stared at an envelope that lay unopened before him. Maria stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder, her knuckles white with anxiety. "What's wrong?" Tommy asked, genuinely concerned despite years of mistreatment. "Nothing that concerns you," Marco snapped, but his usual arrogance was tempered by obvious fear. "Just family business. Real family business," added Sal, though his voice cracked slightly on the words. Vincent finally opened the envelope with trembling fingers. As he read the contents, his face grew even paler. The letter was brief, written in elegant script on expensive paper. Though Tommy couldn't see the words, he could read the terror in Vincent's expression. "We have to leave," Vincent whispered. "Tonight." "What are you talking about?" Maria demanded. "This is our home, our life." "Our life is over," Vincent replied, his voice hollow. "They found us. After all these years, they finally found us." Tommy watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. The Romano family had always been secretive about their past, particularly Vincent's origins and the circumstances that had brought them to Chicago. Now, faced with whatever message that envelope contained, their carefully constructed world was crumbling. As the family erupted into frantic preparations for departure, Tommy retreated to his small corner of the apartment. He had few possessions to pack: a change of clothes, a worn leather journal where he recorded his thoughts, and a single photograph of his deceased mother. As he gathered these meager belongings, he wondered what this sudden upheaval would mean for his own uncertain future. Outside, the Chicago night hummed with its usual mixture of vice and violence, unaware that the life of one seemingly insignificant young man was about to change forever. The train's rhythmic clacking provided a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in the Romano household just hours before. Tommy stared out the window at the American countryside rushing past in the pre-dawn darkness, his mind racing with questions that no one seemed willing to answer. Vincent had purchased tickets to New York with money Tommy had never known the family possessed, and the entire journey had been conducted in tense silence. "Pa, you need to tell us what's happening," Marco finally demanded as the train pulled into Union Station in New York City. His usual bravado had been replaced by genuine fear. Who were those men? What did that letter say? Vincent's hands shook as he lit another cigarette, his fourth since boarding the train. "Some things are better left buried," he muttered, but his eyes darted nervously around the crowded platform. "We just need to disappear for a while. Start fresh." The family found temporary lodging in a run-down boarding house in Little Italy, a neighborhood that felt both foreign and familiar to Tommy. The narrow streets were lined with tenements similar to those in Chicago, but there was an intensity here that he hadn't experienced before. Men in expensive suits conversed in rapid Italian on street corners, their conversations punctuated by meaningful glances and subtle hand gestures. While the Romano family huddled in their cramped room, debating their next move, Tommy explored the neighborhood. He had always been drawn to the stories whispered among the factory workers back in Chicago, tales of powerful families, ancient codes of honor, and blood feuds that spanned generations. Now, walking through the heart of New York's Italian community, those stories felt more real than ever. It was in Washington Square Park that Tommy's life changed forever. He was sitting on a bench, sketching the urban landscape in his worn journal, when an elderly man in an impeccably tailored gray suit approached him. The man moved with the same quiet authority Tommy had noticed in the figure outside the textile factory, and his weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen both great triumphs and terrible losses. "You have your mother's eyes," the man said softly, settling onto the bench beside Tommy with the careful movements of someone much older than his apparent age. Tommy looked up sharply, his pencil frozen in mid-stroke. "You knew my mother." "Isabella was. She was everything good in this world," the man replied, his voice heavy with old grief. I loved her more than life itself, but I lost her to circumstances beyond my control. I never knew she had a son. The revelation hit Tommy like a physical blow. For 15 years, he had wondered about his origins, about the father who had never been mentioned, about the life his mother had led before her death. Now, faced with this stranger who spoke of her with such obvious devotion, he felt the foundation of his understanding begin to shift. My name is Salvatore Castellano, the man continued, extending a hand that bore a distinctive gold ring. And if you are indeed Isabella's son, then you are my grandson. The name sent shockwaves through Tommy's consciousness. Castellano, the same name as the textile factory where he had worked, the same name whispered with a mixture of fear and respect throughout Chicago's underworld. He stared at the man who claimed to be his grandfather, searching for some resemblance, some confirmation of this impossible truth. "You're the Romano family," Salvatore continued. "They were paid to care for you after Isabella's death, paid handsomely to keep you hidden, to ensure you grew up far from the dangers of our world. But Vincent's gambling debts and his loose tongue finally caught up with him. My enemies discovered his identity, and through him, yours." Tommy's mind reeled as pieces of a complex puzzle began to fall into place. Vincent's mysterious income despite their apparent poverty, the family's secretiveness about their past, the terror that had gripped them upon receiving that letter. Everything suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "I don't understand," Tommy said, though part of him was beginning to understand all too well. What enemies? What dangers? Salvatore's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing events from long ago. The Castellano family has controlled significant portions of New York's commercial interests for 3 generations. We have built an empire through determination, strategic thinking, and when necessary, decisive action. But empires create enemies, and those enemies have been circling like vultures, waiting for signs of weakness. Over the next several hours, as they walked through the winding streets of Little Italy, Salvatore painted a picture of a world Tommy had only glimpsed in fragments. He spoke of territorial disputes between powerful families, of complex webs of loyalty and betrayal, of a code of honor that governed interactions between men who lived outside the law's protection. "Your mother wanted something different for you," Salvatore explained as they paused outside a restaurant that bore the Castellano name. "She believed there was too much violence in our world, too much pain. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, you would be raised far from all of this. But now I'm here," Tommy said, stating the obvious. "Now you're here," Salvatore agreed. "And circumstances have changed dramatically. 3 of my most trusted lieutenants have been killed in the past month. Someone is systematically dismantling everything I've built, and I'm running out of people I can trust." They entered the restaurant through a private entrance, climbing a narrow staircase to a room that served as both office and fortress. The walls were lined with photographs spanning decades, images of men in formal attire, family gatherings, and business meetings that had shaped the destiny of New York's underworld. In several of the older photographs, Tommy could see his mother, young and radiant, standing beside Salvatore with obvious affection. "She was my only child," Salvatore said, noticing Tommy's focus on the images. "When she died, I thought the bloodline ended with her. I never imagined she had given me a grandson." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A young man entered, his movements quick and efficient despite an obvious limp. He whispered something in Salvatore's ear, and the old man's expression darkened. "It seems our enemies have grown bolder," Salvatore said grimly. "There was an attempt on Vincent Romano's life an hour ago. He's dead, along with his wife. The boys you grew up with are missing." Tommy felt the world tilt around him. Despite years of mistreatment, the Romanos had been the only family he'd known. Vincent's cruelty had been familiar, predictable. Maria's indifference had been constant. Even Marco and Sal's torments had been part of the rhythm of his life. Now they were gone, swept away by forces he was only beginning to understand. "This is my fault," Salvatore continued, his voice heavy with guilt. "By acknowledging you, by bringing you here, I've painted a target on everyone connected to your previous life. The other families see you as either a threat to be eliminated or an opportunity to strike at me." Tommy sank into a leather chair, overwhelmed by the rapid succession of revelations and tragedies. In the space of a single day, his understanding of himself, his past, and his future had been completely overturned. He was no longer Tommy Romano, the unwanted adopted son of a poor family. He was Thomas Castellano, heir to a criminal empire he never knew existed. "What happens now?" he asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Salvatore moved to the window, gazing out at the city that sprawled below them like a vast chessboard. "Now you must choose, grandson. You can walk away from all of this. I can arrange for a new identity, money to start fresh somewhere far from New York. You can live the quiet life your mother wanted for you. Or you can stay and learn what it means to be a Castellano. You can help me identify our enemies and ensure that your mother's death, and the deaths of the Romanos, are properly avenged. But understand, once you enter this world fully, there is no going back. The rules are different here. The stakes are life and death." Tommy closed his eyes, thinking of his mother's face in those faded photographs, thinking of Vincent and Maria Romano lying dead in a New York alley, thinking of the years of humiliation and rejection he had endured while his true heritage remained hidden. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was clear. "Teach me," he said simply. "Teach me everything." Salvatore smiled for the first time since their meeting began. "Then we begin tonight. But first, you need to understand the most important lesson of all. In this world, family is everything, and everything else is just business." The basement beneath Castellano's restaurant hummed with quiet efficiency. It was here, away from prying eyes and curious ears, that Salvatore conducted the real business of his empire. Tommy descended the narrow stairs for the first time 3 days after learning his true identity, his footsteps echoing off brick walls that had witnessed decades of clandestine meetings and life-altering decisions. "The first rule," Salvatore said, settling behind a massive oak desk that dominated the room, "is that power without knowledge is merely violence. Violence without purpose is chaos. We are not chaotic men, Thomas. We are strategic." The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of information and transformation. Tommy had been moved from the boarding house to a private apartment above an Italian bakery, complete with new clothes, proper meals, and round-the-clock protection. More importantly, he had begun his education in the complex world of organized crime that operated parallel to legitimate society. "And tell me about the families," Salvatore instructed, spreading a hand-drawn map of New York City across the desk. Different neighborhoods were marked with various symbols and colors, creating a visual representation of territory, influence, and power. Tommy studied the map intently. The Torinos control the docks on the east side. They've been losing ground since Prohibition started because they refuse to get involved in bootlegging. The Benedetto family runs numbers and protection rackets in Brooklyn, but they're overextended. The Morettis, he paused, remembering the lessons from the previous day. The Morettis are the most dangerous because they're unpredictable. They'll break agreements if they see short-term profit. Good. Salvatore nodded approvingly. "And what does this tell you about our current situation?" "Someone is playing the families against each other," Tommy replied, connecting patterns he was only beginning to understand. "The attacks on your lieutenants, the pressure on the Torinos, even the death of the Romanos. They're all connected. Someone wants chaos because chaos creates opportunities." Salvatore's eyes gleamed with approval and something else. Pride, perhaps, or hope. "You have your mother's intelligence and your grandfather's instincts. That combination could make you very powerful, or very dead." A soft knock interrupted their lesson. Carlo Benedetti, Salvatore's most trusted advisor, entered the room with the careful movements of a man who had survived 30 years in a dangerous profession. His weathered face bore the scars of old conflicts, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who trusted no one completely. "We have a problem," Carlo announced without preamble. "The Moretti boy, Anthony, has been asking questions about the new addition to our family. He knows Tommy's here, and he's been spreading rumors that we're grooming an outsider to take over operations." Salvatore's expression darkened. "Anthony Moretti has always been ambitious beyond his capabilities. His father keeps him in check, but barely. There's more," Carlo continued. "3 of our bookkeeping operations were hit last night. professional jobs. They knew exactly where the money was kept, exactly how to avoid our security. This wasn't random. Tommy watched the exchange with growing understanding. The world his grandfather inhabited was one of constant calculation and perpetual vigilance. Every decision carried consequences. Every alliance contained the seeds of future betrayal. Every moment of weakness invited attack from competitors who viewed compassion as vulnerability. "We need to send a message," Salvatore said finally. "But it must be proportional and strategic. Tommy, this will be your first lesson in practical application." Over the following hours, Tommy observed as his grandfather orchestrated a response that was both subtle and devastating. Rather than engaging in open warfare, Salvatore used information, carefully leaked details about Anthony Moretti's private gambling debts, strategic tips to rival bookmakers about upcoming raids, and the strategic withdrawal of protection from several Moretti-owned businesses. "Violence is the tool of last resort," Salvatore explained as they watched events unfold from their secure vantage point. "Information is a scalpel. Violence is a sledgehammer. A skilled surgeon uses a scalpel." The next morning brought news that Anthony Moretti had been forced to flee New York after his creditors, suddenly aware of his financial vulnerabilities, had demanded immediate payment. 2 Moretti gambling operations had been shut down by police raids that seemed remarkably well informed about illegal activities. The message had been received and understood throughout the underworld. But Tommy was learning that every action created reactions, and success often bred new problems. Word of the Castellano family's strategic response spread quickly through the networks of informants, dealers, and enforcers that connected New York's various criminal enterprises. Some saw it as a sign of strength, others viewed it as an escalation that demanded response. "Your real education begins now," Salvatore announced as they prepared for a meeting with representatives from the other major families. "Today you learn to read men's faces, to hear the words they don't speak, to understand the difference between temporary alliances and permanent enemies." The meeting took place in a private dining room at Rouse, a restaurant that served as neutral ground for interfamily negotiations. Tommy sat silently beside his grandfather, observing as men who had spent decades navigating treacherous waters of loyalty and betrayal attempted to maintain a delicate balance of power. Dominic Torino arrived first, his massive frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the room with the practiced eyes of a man accustomed to danger. Despite his family's recent losses, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who understood that showing weakness could prove fatal. "Moody Salvatore," he said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of honest work alongside the gold rings of criminal success. "I hear congratulations are in order. A grandson is a blessing at any age." "Family is everything, Dominic," Salvatore replied, accepting the handshake while studying the other man's expression for signs of hidden meaning. "Uno, I'm sure you understand." Francesco Benedetto entered next, accompanied by his son Michael, a young man roughly Tommy's age whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone raised in the shadow of violence. Unlike the other families, the Benedettos had always prided themselves on maintaining strict hierarchies and unquestioning loyalty. "An interesting development," Francesco observed, his gaze settling on Tommy with obvious assessment. "The young man has an intelligent face. Intelligence can be valuable, properly channeled." The final arrival was Vincent Moretti, Anthony's father, whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. Where the others maintained facades of respectful neutrality, Moretti's hostility was barely contained. His son's humiliation had wounded both his pride and his practical position within New York's criminal hierarchy. "So this is the famous grandson," Moretti said, his voice carrying undertones of threat and resentment. "Funny how he appears just as our mutual business relationships become complicated." Tommy felt the tension in the room escalate, understanding instinctively that this moment would define his place in the complex web of relationships that governed his new world. Every eye was on him, every ear attuned to his response. His grandfather had taught him that respect was earned through strength, but that strength could be demonstrated in many ways. "Mr. Moretti," Tommy said, rising to his feet with deliberate composure, "I understand your son has decided to pursue opportunities outside New York. I hope his travels prove educational." The silence that followed was profound. Tommy had acknowledged Moretti's implied threat, while simultaneously demonstrating that he was neither intimidated nor impressed by the older man's reputation. More importantly, he had done so with the kind of understated confidence that marked him as someone worth taking seriously. Salvatore smiled slightly, recognizing both his own tactical approach and something uniquely his grandson's in the response. The other men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about shifting perceptions and recalculated strategies. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering territorial boundaries, percentage arrangements, and the delicate protocols that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into full-scale wars. Tommy absorbed every detail, understanding that he was witnessing the machinery of power in operation. As they prepared to leave, Dominic Torino approached Tommy privately. "Your grandfather is a good man in a profession that doesn't always reward goodness," he said quietly. "Learn from him, but remember that the world is changing. The old ways may not be enough for what's coming." Walking home through the darkening streets of Little Italy, Tommy reflected on the day's lessons. He was beginning to understand that his grandfather's empire was built on more than fear or violence. It was constructed from relationships, maintained through reputation, and sustained by the kind of strategic thinking that treated every interaction as a move in an infinitely complex game. "You did well today," Salvatore said as they climbed the stairs to the restaurant's upper floors. "But remember, today was merely introduction. Tomorrow, we begin preparing you for real responsibility." That night, alone in his apartment above the bakery, Tommy stared out at the city lights and wondered what his mother would think of the path he had chosen. He was no longer the humiliated adopted son struggling to find his place in an indifferent world. He was Thomas Castellano, heir to an empire built on blood and ambition, student of lessons that could save his life or end it. The boy who had once pressed his face against tenement windows, dreaming of power and respect, was gone forever. In his place stood a young man who was beginning to understand that power was not simply taken, it was earned, one careful decision at a time. The first assassination attempt came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. Tommy was leaving the Columbia University Library, where he had spent the afternoon studying business law under his grandfather's insistence that legitimate knowledge was as important as street wisdom. The shot came from across Broadway, shattering the window of a delicatessen inches from his head. Training kicked in before conscious thought. Tommy dropped to the pavement, rolled behind a parked automobile, and drew the .38 revolver that had become as familiar as his wallet in the 3 months since his introduction to the Castellano organization. The street erupted in chaos as pedestrians screamed and scattered, but Tommy's focus narrowed to identifying his attacker's position and planning his response. "Two shooters," he called to Frankie Torino, his assigned bodyguard, who had taken cover behind a newspaper stand. One in the hotel window, second floor, the others moving south on foot. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, one attacker lay dead in the hotel room, and the second had escaped into the maze of Manhattan's side streets. Tommy had fired 4 shots, all precisely placed, all effective. The boy who had once trembled at Vincent Romano's harsh words had become someone who could face death with steady hands and calculated courage. "Welcome to the family business," Frankie said dryly as police sirens wailed in the distance. "Your grandfather's going to be real proud." But Salvatore's reaction was far more complex than pride. In the secure basement office beneath the restaurant, he paced like a caged animal, while Tommy recounted the attack with clinical precision. "This changes everything," Salvatore muttered, studying photographs of the dead assassin that Carlo had obtained from contacts within the police department. "Giuseppe Marconi. He's worked for the Benedetto family for 5 years. This wasn't random street crime." Tommy absorbed this information with growing unease. Francesco Benedetto had seemed genuinely respectful during their meeting at Rouse, but appearances could be deceiving in a world where survival often depended on successful deception. "Why would they move against me directly?" Tommy asked. "I'm not a threat to their operations." "You're not a threat yet," Carlo corrected from his position near the door. "But you represent something more dangerous than immediate competition. You represent the future. Every family knows that Salvatore won't live forever. The question of succession has been theoretical, until now." Over the following days, intelligence flowed into the Castellano organization from dozens of sources. street-level informants, corrupt officials, bartenders who overheard late-night conversations, and bookmakers who tracked the subtle shifts in betting odds that reflected changing perceptions of power. The picture that emerged was troubling. A coalition was forming, not openly, but through careful whispers and strategic positioning. The Benedetto and Moretti families were coordinating their activities, testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses. More concerning, they had reached out to families in Chicago and Philadelphia, seeking to build alliances that could overwhelm New York's established order. "They're afraid," Salvatore explained during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Judy, my generation built this system through cooperation and mutual benefit. But the younger generation sees only opportunity in chaos. They believe that if they can eliminate experienced leadership, they can divide our territories among themselves." Tommy had been studying maps and financial records, applying the analytical skills developed during his months of intensive education. "The numbers don't support their strategy," he observed. "Our operations generate consistent profit because they're built on relationships and reputation. If they fragment the system, everyone's revenues will decrease." "Logic doesn't always govern human behavior," Salvatore replied. "Pride, ambition, and fear can override practical considerations. These men don't want steady profits. They want to be kings of their own small kingdoms." The second attempt on Tommy's life came during a routine collection from a restaurant in Brooklyn. This time, the attackers were more sophisticated. 3 men with military training who had researched his patterns and chosen their moment carefully. But Tommy had been learning more than business theory and criminal law. Every morning, he trained with Angelo Torino, a former boxer who taught him to read body language, to move efficiently in confined spaces, and to use urban environments as tactical advantages. The fight took place in the restaurant's narrow alley, where confined spaces neutralized numerical superiority. Tommy's attackers expected a pampered rich boy playing at being a gangster. Instead, they encountered someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. When backup arrived, 2 attackers were dead, and the third was wounded but alive, a development that would prove more valuable than 3 corpses. Under questioning, the surviving assassin revealed information that confirmed Salvatore's worst fears. The attacks weren't random violence or even standard territorial disputes. They were coordinated strikes designed to eliminate the Castellano family's next generation before he could assume full control. "They're not just trying to kill you," Salvatore said grimly. "They're trying to kill the idea of you. If they can demonstrate that my heir is vulnerable, that succession isn't guaranteed, it undermines everything we've built." The revelation transformed Tommy's understanding of his position. He wasn't simply learning to manage criminal enterprises. He was becoming the focal point of a struggle that would determine the future structure of organized crime in New York and beyond. The response, when it came, was swift and devastating. Working with loyal elements from the Torino family, who had their own reasons to fear a Benedetto-Moretti alliance, Salvatore orchestrated a series of strikes that crippled his enemies' most profitable operations. But instead of using direct violence, he employed the more subtle approaches that had made him successful. Michael Benedetto, Francesco's son and heir apparent, found himself arrested on federal tax evasion charges after carefully preserved financial records mysteriously found their way to Treasury Department investigators. Anthony Moretti, attempting to rebuild his reputation from Philadelphia, discovered that his new associates had been systematically informed about his past failures and current vulnerabilities. Most importantly, Salvatore demonstrated that the Castellano organization had deeper resources and more sophisticated intelligence networks than their enemies had realized. The message was clear. Challenging the established order carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate territorial disputes, but victory came with costs that extended beyond financial expenditures or lost personnel. Tommy was beginning to understand that every action in this world created obligations, debts, and enemies that could persist for generations. The men he had killed would have families who might seek revenge. The alliances formed during the conflict would require maintenance and reciprocation. The reputation he was building as someone not to be underestimated would attract new challenges from competitors who needed to test themselves against his growing legend. "Power is not a destination," Salvatore observed during one of their late-night discussions. It's a condition that must be constantly maintained. The moment you believe you've achieved security, you've become vulnerable to those who are still hungry. Tommy nodded, understanding that his grandfather was preparing him for responsibilities that extended far beyond managing illegal businesses. He was being groomed to become a leader who could navigate the complex relationships between criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, political figures, and law enforcement agencies. The transformation was evident in more than his tactical capabilities. The uncertain teenager who had arrived in New York just months earlier had developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving genuine tests. He walked differently, spoke with greater authority, and commanded respect from men who had initially seen him as an outsider playing at belonging. But late at night, alone in his apartment above the bakery, Tommy sometimes wondered what Isabella Romano would think of the man her son was becoming. The world she had tried to protect him from had claimed him anyway, shaping him into someone who could kill without hesitation, who could calculate violence as casually as profit margins, who could inspire both loyalty and fear in equal measure. The boy who had once dreamed of escaping Chicago's tenements had indeed found power and respect, but he was learning that both came with prices that could never be fully paid, only continuously managed through strength, intelligence, and the kind of cold pragmatism that his grandfather had spent decades perfecting. As winter approached, Tommy Castellano prepared for the greatest test of all, the formal assumption of responsibilities that would mark his transition from heir to leader, from student to master of his own destiny. The meeting that would determine Tommy's future took place in the abandoned warehouse where his grandfather had conducted business for over 20 years. Representatives from every major family in the Northeast had gathered for what everyone understood would be a pivotal moment in the region's criminal hierarchy. At 21, Tommy stood at the threshold between the world he had inherited and the empire he would create. Snow fell steadily outside, muffling the sounds of the city and creating an atmosphere of isolation that suited the gravity of the occasion. Inside the warehouse, portable heaters fought against the December cold, while men who controlled millions in illegal revenue sat around a collection of mismatched tables, their breath visible in the frigid air. Salvatore had aged visibly in the years since Tommy's arrival. The stress of maintaining control while grooming his heir had taken its toll, and recent medical examinations had revealed the heart problems that made succession no longer a distant consideration, but an immediate necessity. "Gentlemen," Salvatore began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in leadership, "we gather tonight to address the question that has shaped our recent conflicts. The Castellano organization has grown beyond what any single man can effectively manage. The time has come to formalize arrangements that will ensure stability and continuity." Dominic Torino nodded slowly, his massive frame hunched slightly with age but his eyes still sharp with intelligence. "We've all seen what happens when succession isn't clear. Chicago's still cleaning up the mess from the Capone transition. We don't need that kind of chaos here." Francesco Benedetto shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Since his son's arrest and conviction on federal charges, his position had been significantly weakened. The alliance with the Morettis had crumbled under pressure, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. "The boy is untested," Benedetto said, his voice carrying the desperation of a man whose options had been systematically eliminated. "Leadership requires more than bloodline. It requires proof of capability under genuine pressure." Tommy had anticipated this challenge. For months, he had been preparing not just for this moment, but for the years of leadership that would follow. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate and confident, and walked to the center of the circle where all eyes could focus on him. "Mr. Benedetto raises a valid concern," Tommy began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Leadership does require proof, so let me offer some evidence for your consideration." He gestured to Carlo, who distributed folders containing detailed financial records and operational summaries. "In the past 8 months, revenues from our territories have increased by 37%. Our political connections have expanded to include 2 federal judges, 5 state legislators, and 11 city officials. Our security networks have prevented 14 separate attempts at infiltration by law enforcement agencies." The numbers were impressive, but Tommy understood that statistics alone wouldn't establish his authority. What mattered was demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the delicate balances that kept their world functioning. More importantly, Tommy continued, we've established new protocols that reduce exposure while increasing efficiency. Every operation now has legitimate business cover. Every financial transaction flows through legal channels that can withstand federal scrutiny. Every territorial agreement includes provisions for peaceful dispute resolution. Vincent Moretti, who had remained silent throughout the evening, finally spoke. Pretty words from a college boy. But can he make the hard decisions? Can he order a man's death and sleep peacefully that same night? The warehouse fell silent. Everyone present understood that this was the crucial test, not intelligence or education or even strategic capability, but the fundamental question of whether Tommy possessed the ruthless pragmatism that ultimate authority required. Tommy met Moretti's gaze directly, his expression calm but implacable. 3 months ago, your son Anthony attempted to establish independent operations in our territory, using information he obtained through torture of one of our bookkeepers. That bookkeeper, Tommy Sangliolo, had been with our organization for 12 years. He had a wife and 3 children. The temperature in the room seemed to drop further as Tommy continued. Anthony is currently in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, serving a sentence for crimes he actually committed. But his cell assignment, his work detail, and his daily routines have been carefully arranged through contacts we've maintained for years. He will serve his full sentence, but he will serve it safely, as long as certain understandings are maintained. Tommy paused, allowing the implications to settle. I could have had Anthony killed. It would have been simpler and more traditional, but dead men can't suffer, and they can't serve as examples. More importantly, killing him would have required escalation that would have harmed everyone's business interests. Vincent Moretti's face had gone pale. The sophisticated nature of Tommy's response, punishment that was both personal and strategic, immediate and long-term, demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that separated true leaders from simple enforcers. The question isn't whether I can order a man's death, Tommy concluded. The question is whether I can choose not to, when restraint serves our larger interests better than violence. Salvatore smiled with obvious pride, but also with something else. Relief, perhaps, that his grandson had proven himself worthy of the trust being placed in him. The formal vote was unanimous, though Tommy understood that unanimity in this room often masked private reservations and future challenges. What mattered was that he had established his authority through demonstration rather than inheritance, through capability rather than sentiment. But even as the meeting concluded and hands were shaken and traditional pledges of cooperation were exchanged, Tommy knew that real leadership would be measured by results achieved over years, not words spoken in a single evening. The months that followed tested every lesson Tommy had learned, and several he had to improvise. The end of Prohibition in 1933 required rapid adaptation of revenue streams and organizational structures. New forms of federal law enforcement demanded more sophisticated security measures, and the economic pressures of the Great Depression created both opportunities and vulnerabilities that required constant attention. Under Tommy's leadership, the Castellano organization evolved into something that transcended traditional criminal enterprises. They established legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal activities, while generating substantial legal profits. They developed political connections that offered protection without creating dependence. They built financial networks that could weather economic storms while maintaining operational flexibility. Most importantly, Tommy created a culture that valued intelligence over violence, strategy over tactics, and long-term stability over short-term gains. The young man who had once been humiliated as an unwanted adopted son had become the architect of a new model for organized crime that would influence similar organizations across the country. The transformation was symbolized by the new headquarters Tommy established in a Manhattan office building, legitimate businesses occupying the upper floors, with carefully concealed operational centers below. The contrast with the basement meetings and warehouse gatherings of his grandfather's era was deliberate and meaningful. But success came with costs that Tommy was still learning to measure. Relationships with family members who couldn't adapt to changing methods. Constant vigilance against competitors who viewed innovation as weakness. and the isolating burden of making decisions that affected hundreds of people, while trusting very few with complete honesty about his doubts and fears. On a cold February evening in 1935, Tommy stood in his office overlooking the city that had become his kingdom. At 23, he controlled operations that generated more money than most corporations, commanded loyalty from men who had initially seen him as an interloper, and possessed the kind of power that his 15-year-old self could never have imagined. The boy who had once pressed his face against tenement windows, dreaming of respect and authority, had achieved both. But he had also learned that power was not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be carried, not a destination to be reached, but a burden to be borne with wisdom and strength. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his reflections. Carlo's voice carried the urgency that meant new challenges, new decisions, new tests of the leadership capabilities that had been forged through trials Tommy couldn't have anticipated when he first learned his true identity. "We have a situation developing in Chicago," Carlo reported. "The outfit is fragmenting, and they're looking for new partnerships. Could be an opportunity, but it could also be a trap." Tommy smiled slightly, recognizing the familiar pattern of challenge and possibility that defined his world. The unwanted adopted son had indeed inherited a throne, but he had learned that wearing a crown required strength that went far beyond surviving humiliation or even ordering men's deaths. It required the wisdom to distinguish between opportunities and threats, the courage to make difficult decisions without complete information, and the endurance to carry responsibilities that could never be fully shared or completely trusted to others. "Set up a meeting," Tommy said, settling into his chair and reaching for the files that would help him prepare for whatever came next. "But make sure we control the location and the terms. We are not the desperate ones anymore." Outside his window, New York City continued its restless existence, unaware that some of its most important business was being conducted by a young man who had learned to transform humiliation into strength, rejection into determination, and inherited power into earned authority. The crown he wore was indeed made of thorns, but Tommy Castellano had learned to wear it with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that true power came not from what others gave you, but from what you made of whatever circumstances life provided. In the end, he had become exactly what his enemies had feared, and his allies had hoped, a leader who could adapt to changing times, while honoring the essential codes that made their dangerous world function. The adopted son who had once been nothing had become the architect of everything that would follow.